The webinar is now being recorded, and that's useful for future reference. And also, if you have any colleagues who were unable to join us today, feel free to let them know that we are recording the webinar and it will be posted eventually. Once captioned and approved for posting, it'll be posted on the PA Resources website. All right, so let's just dive right into it now and get into what you're here for. First, another welcome, an official welcome to the eData 23-24 opening webinar. We've of course had the system open since yesterday, but we wanted to chat and make sure that we had an opportunity to present to you directly some of the items that are new and updated in eData for this program year, and also introduce ourselves. So I am, if you don't already know, I am Michael McCarty. I work here as part of the eData tech support along with Steve Linus, who is also on the webinar this morning. What we do, in case you are new to the field, and if you are, welcome, and welcome to the wide world of eData. If you're new to the field, Steve and I are what's sort of known as eData tech support. And we do just pretty much what the title says. Our project provides phone and email tech support. We maintain the database access template that supports data analysis. And we'll mention something a little bit about template news later. And there will be further discussions down the road about the template. So we're really not going to spend any additional time on that today, just an update toward the end of the webinar. Additionally, we work to update some forms and documents that support the eData system, which we'll also mention here briefly in a moment or two. And last but not least, one of the main things we do is provide the Introduction to eData course, which is the requirement for data entry staff in the eData system. And I think most of you know all of that already. You've experienced that, but in case you're new, that's a little bit about what we do. To jump right into what you're here for, which is the start of this program year, 23-24, and I can't believe 24 is a number that we're talking about already, but here it is, it's upon us. And so that's of course part of this program year. And to prepare data entry in eData, we want to just provide a few reminders. Many of you have done this for years, but some of it is starting the program year in eData is an annual thing. It's once a year. So it's good to reflect on what's necessary and helpful at the beginning of the program year. Supports for that include the manual glossary and the quick start guide. There's multiple documents on the PA Adult Ed Resources website, but those two documents are the core documents, particularly the Quick Start Guide at this time of year. That's the most timely document. The Quick Start Guide does not replace the manual glossary in terms of a guide that instructs the use of eData. The manual glossary is still your core document for that. However, the Quick Start Guide does provide some highlights that are useful for this time in the program year. It's important to note that not all agencies have access to eData currently. So we're sitting here August 16th, and you may not have your eData access at this time. eData access is determined directly from your grant status in eGrants, and there's something called the eData accepted step. That status or beyond will mean that you will then see your information, your contract information for your agency in eData. If that is not approved, you will not see that information in eData. Some of you have multiple contracts. Some also have subcontractors. The information in eData for all of those items will not appear until eData approved or beyond in the eGrant system. So if you're watching this and you're panicking, you're trying to get into eData and you don't see anything, that's okay. Or it might be okay. If it's certainly expected if you don't have your grants approved. So usually what happens is while eData did open yesterday, there will be a slow trickle of contract additions over the days and weeks here to follow. And that will be what provides you access to eData and your contract information. If you don't have access, or if you're just getting it now, you can still spend some time planning. And that's what the plan for little reminder here on the slide is for, just to say, plan for organizing your records and plan to enter those records chronologically. That's going to help you tremendously. eData is designed as a data system to accept data entry in chronological order. What you can do to help with that and help organize your records is, in the past, we've suggested this and we'll continue to suggest it. Organize your records by month, starting, of course, with the beginning of the program year in July. There is an order also, in addition to a chronological consideration, there's a record order suggestion located in the manual glossary, and it basically says what kinds of records to create first. You want to start with class records, then staff, then adult, and then so on down the line. And that just simply prevents a lot of backtracking. Now, there is a little bit of confusion potentially that could exist with, and when I say confusion, it's, let's say I have 3 different contracts, 5.4, 6.4, and 6.1, but only my 6.1 is currently in eData. Then you might have to do a little more thinking around how you get organized and what you put in. For example, you can add adult records to the eData system without any contract information. So as long as you have a grant in eData, you can begin adding all of your adults. Just know that for any of those adults that are assigned to grants not yet in eData, you'll have to come back to those adult records and assign them to your other activities, your classes, groups, and pairs, because you won't be able to add those until you have that contract specific information. So the beginning of the program year does require some thought. For those of you that have been down this road before, you likely have those things in mind. If you're new and want some guidance as to maybe how to best prepare to do data entry, you've got those 2 documents to consult, but also, of course, as always, feel free to call us or email us. But that's just a little overview of just how things get in the system and some procedures to keep in mind as you begin your data entry. Once you're in eData, and once you are starting that data entry, you want to check some things. You want to check your agency contact, and what that is that's actually a role in eData. Not to get too much into the weeds of how access to eData works, there's, of course, a front-end portal called the MyPDE Suite that serves as a gateway to get to the eData system. Most of you are either have a data entry role or perhaps a security administrator role in eData, which lets you log into MyPDE Suite, click on the eData link, takes you right to the website. The role that you have defines what you're allowed to do in eData in addition to giving you access. There is an agency contact role, which determines who by name and phone number shows up on the agency contact for your agency. That is important to have because mostly if you share a student with another agency, that's who the agency you share the student with knows how to reach you and vice versa. So it can be really helpful and useful to have that shortcut there, that agency contact info, not for yourself, but for others who may need to reach out and touch base about assessments or other information with shared students, for example. We've already mentioned it before, but when you get into eData for the first time, check those contracts. If you've gotten in and you have more than one contract, it does not necessarily mean you have access to everything. And what shows up in your contracts will directly determine the contract type that you can assign to your class, groups, and pairs. So you won't be able to create those activity records until you get the appropriate contract in the system. It is possible that those contracts and your what's called agency activity summaries, there could be errors. We haven't seen it recently, but in the past there have been issues with the transfer of numbers from eGrants that we keep talking about to eData. Check those enrollment numbers, make sure they're correct. Check for each contract. We had an issue a few years ago where enrollment numbers were modified by a factor of 10. A bunch of zeros got added, and that's obviously problematic because that feeds into your reports in the Access template, and that'll just cause issues. So you want to resolve that. And there's nothing you can do. You can't change the numbers. They're read-only in the eData system. However, if you see those numbers in there and they're incorrect, it's just as simple as going in and saying, hey, send us an email, these numbers are wrong, and we'll begin the process of working through resolving that issue for you. Also, if you have a subcontractor, check those numbers as well. That's really the first step. That's like day one when you get into eData. Some other reminders as you work through then specific records in eData is as you're rolling over your staff, be sure to update their adult ed years of experience. That is, if I remember correctly, that's a 3-part field that says less than 1 year, more than 1 year, more than 3 years, depending on when they started with your agency or just started in adult ed overall. As you begin the year this year, they may pass from one of those criteria into the next. So you want to make sure that field gets updated. Additionally, as always, near matches, please resolve those as early as possible, especially now while none of us have the template to run. We can't run the template to see what near matches exist easily. So as those occur, make a note, send us an email right away. Email is probably the easiest way to resolve near matches. But if you have questions, you can certainly give us a phone call as well. Then we have to just we're going to drill down a little deeper now into some specific items. And after I review these items, then I'll go ahead and do a quick demonstration in the eData test site just to show you specifically some of what we've been talking about. New things for this year. There's nothing really major new this year. There are several existing fields, however, that have been renamed for clarity. The function of those fields is identical. So for example, instead of saying period of participation enrollment date, we've renamed that field now to say period of participation start date. So it really reflects what it truly is. It wasn't the date the person was enrolled, it's the date that they started. We've also provided a new definition in the system manual glossary that says the start date for an adult is the date of first instruction. So that is a change from previous years. You'll want to keep that in mind when adding your students because the start date, as you all know, is pretty critical in determining several things, enrollment and test validity being 2 of those things. Also in adult records, there are new options for when the residence is selected as being institutional. The options have been simplified. There were 4 or 5 options before, it's now 3. I'll show those to you in about a minute or 2. And a new field, additionally in adult records still, are the pronoun and gender fields. These aren't new to the form. You had been collecting those responses from students in the past. Now those responses can be transferred and data entered into eData itself. So before, I'm going to hold off on this particular slide. Let me just get out of here. And I'm going to just transition right over to the eData test site. And before I show anything here, Rosa has a question. So go ahead, Rosa.
Yes, Michael, the first day of instruction, if I do that in eData, I won't be able to enter the test hours. So I normally use the testing day for the first day of enrollment. Is that okay? That's okay?
Well, what I would suggest, because this is new, is you have something that you are doing that is, because what's going to happen, Rosa, here is it's hard for me to provide a single answer to this because what's going to happen is some students will have assessment and maybe some instructional hours on one day. Maybe those days will be different. Maybe they'll be within the same week and they'll be captured at the end of the week when the total student hours are entered into eData for the week or for every 2 weeks. What I would suggest is if you have a unique situation with a student with their start date and they're getting hours in a class, that is the date that you use as the start date.
Can you say that again?
Yes, so what I would suggest is if the first date that the student has hours in a class, that's their start date.
But if I do that in eData, I won't be able to enter actual testing hours.
That would be a question for your advisor to see how to manage that.
Got it.
And this is something it's a new definition, and the start date really shouldn't have theoretically anything to do with assessments. And so that's why we actually took the wording. And when I said we, it was a collaborative effort between the division and ourselves. And so when we took that wording and revised it to say first date of instruction, then really, because the start date is just that, when did the student start their instructional time with the agency? If there's a large discrepancy between the assessment and the instruction, and that would cause issues with picking a date for entering hours in for a class from the instructional hours you want to put in that class, then that's a conversation to have with your advisor, because then there's anytime there's a date discrepancy, I can't tell you change the date. We have to stick with the definition, talk with your advisor. And then, as we go through, to be honest, this is a new thing. So as we go through, if there's any clarity or clarification that we need to have with the start date, we'll let you all know. But for now, if you have a situation like that, let your advisor know and get their thoughts on how you should handle that situation.
Okay. So the let's say the 3.5 hours that they do a testing, where do I enter those hours? On the first week of instruction?
That's the question for your advisor.
Okay, got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. And the reason I'm saying that, Rosa, is because in your example, I think you were, and I don't remember the exact time frame that you had mentioned, but let's say we have a student, let's just use July 1st. July 1st, they take their assessment. They start their work and their coursework July 8th, a week later. So you're absolutely right. If you add the July 8th as the start date for the adult, you assign them to the class on July 8th, you won't be able to give them many hours in the class that, as far as eData is concerned, they're not assigned to. But that's where the question of, can you put those hours in for July 8th will come in for your advisor. Ask them how you should handle that. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does make sense. Like right today we're having orientation for the ASLs. So that will be, for me, that was their first day if they attended testing. But now you're saying that the first day will be if they show to class on September 10th.
Class, correct.
Okay, got it.
That's their class date. Yes, and again, that's because assessments really aren't the determining factor for when a student's actually starting with your agency. It's the date of first instruction. And that will be of benefit to some of you that do wait lists, because you'll be able to give them an assessment. And if they don't start for a couple of weeks, then you will be able to use the first date of instruction, and the assessment will still be valid. That wasn't the intention of changing it. We simplified the definition because that was the accurate definition. But a side benefit that will happen is you'll be more likely that your assessments that you give to the adults when they begin instruction will be valid, because the 30-day timer will be a little bit longer for you, if you will. All right, so it looks like we have some questions. So I'm going to pause the demo here. I'm just going to click on the screen so I don't time out. So let's see, let's go through some questions from the chat. Do most of us begin logging attendance during the intake test? Testing does count towards attendance, and we are technically not supposed to serve students who have not been tested. Yeah, so if there's questions on timing, and that was a question from Sandy, that would be something to ask your advisor. And another question is, how does that work with students rolling over and the tests are counting on for pre-tests? Well, that would, of course, mean that for any rollover test to count, it must be within 150 days of the student's what's now known as start date. And so that means that when you use the first date of instruction as the start date for the student, that you'll just simply have to count backwards from that, and the system will do it for you because it will show or not show previous assessments if they are within 150 days. So that timeline and that expectation is not changing. It just might change if, depending on how you're running the orientations and entering start dates, it might change from how you've experienced some of those rollover timings in the past. And Lauren says, what if they don't show up for class? That is a good question. And so that's another question for your advisor, just to kind of see what happens if they don't show up and they have 0 hours. So that sounds to me, Lauren, like you're basically saying they're assigned to a class. Let's say July 8th again, we'll use that again. They tested July 1st, they're assigned July 8th, but they don't show up till July 21st. Is July 21st their start date? That's a question for your advisor.
I'm sorry, I found my camera on. Can you hear me?
I can sort of, okay, you're a little broken up, Lauren, but I can hear you a little bit.
It's on my desktop. I guess I'm just wondering, to me, first of all, where is this in the new eData instructions? I was looking through and I didn't see it, but I probably skimmed it.
It should be under 2 spots, and it should be under, in the manual, it should be under the numbered guide of how to enter data, next to the, when you get to the period of participation start date field.
Okay.
And there should be another reference to it also in the glossary, which defines the period of participation start date field.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm just confused because I feel like it's always been, well, before, years ago, when they were doing orientation we were just counting a certain number of hours, and then they said, well, we're only going to count for the number of hours for assessment. And so that's what we've always used for the first day, because that was when we first made contact with them. And for us, we did orientation and testing all on the same day, so it makes sense. So I guess I'm wondering now, if they're changing up the start date for the first day of instruction, are they still wanting us to enter in those students? Because I know that they want us to enter in absolutely everybody, even if they don't have an assessment.
That's right.
So what happens? What happens there?
That's right. Yeah. So I would caution everybody to not necessarily change or plan for change with all these, with a lot of other. So we're just talking about, if I scroll down, we're just talking about this field and the date to put in this field right here. Because the definition of what that date is changing, that doesn't imply that you have to necessarily change all these other procedures you have in and around orientation and testing. That is not the implication here. Really, we're just saying this is the start date that you're going to pick from within the student's activities with you. So rather than in the past choosing from the assessment date or the intake date, whichever came first, that was a definition through last year, you are rather going to pick the date of first instruction. So the considerations of whether or not to add someone to eData, the considerations of assessing someone in your orientation process, those would not need to change just necessarily because the period of participation start date field has changed. This is just a data entry consideration for when you would say the student started with you. And if you have an exception, like some of your questions, which are excellent questions, as far as how to count assessment hours now, which has changed in terms of how that is controlled data entry wise by the start date. Or if you have questions about the student doesn't show up, those are questions to direct to your advisor to see what their thoughts are for those exceptions, just as any other exception to guidance would be. So Rosa, did you raise your hand again, or was that from before?
From before, I'm sorry, Michael.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
Let me check here and see. Yep, but we are just finding out that it always had used July 1st for rollovers. Yeah, Susan, go ahead. You're muted if you're trying to talk.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Susan, I can.
Okay. So my internet dropped out. You may have covered this and I just missed it because I had to log back in. So with this new period of participation start date, if someone had a valid assessment as of July 1,
Yep.
but they're not starting class until, say, September 5th, then, and now they're beyond that 150 days, then we would need to do a new pretest, correct?
Well, it depends. So when those of you that remember adult ed before periods of participation, life was much simpler.
Yeah.
And having a data system that goes, that is required. So how do we say this? The data system that we have in eData is designed to capture data within a specific period of time in silos. So we silo the data in eData from July 1st to June 30th. That's stating the obvious. You all know that. But we report data to the federal government via all the NRS standards on a continual basis. And the students' participation with your programming is also continual through the concept of periods of participation. So what happens with situations of students that have previously attended your programming is, and this gets back into some items that are addressed in the Quick Start Guide, when you're entering students' records for the first time in the program year, is there's an assessment that needs to be made to determine whether a student's a continuing student or returning student. And that's the definition. You would need to pick one of those two for any student you've previously served in a previous program year. The period of participation concept, of course, is the ongoing participation of a student with a gap of no more than 90 days. If a student has a more than 90-day gap, you all know that during the program year, if a student leaves and returns more than 90 days after their last date of instruction, you would create a new period of participation. You would add a new start date. You would enter new intake material. So you already all know how that works. That period of participation concept spans across subsequent program years as well, such that if someone is a continuing student, they would get a July 1st start date, not because they're starting on July 1st, but rather that they're continuing their previous already started period of participation start date from the previous year. They already have a start date from the previous year. And since we can't have a continuous or don't have a continuous data system, the idea and the concept behind adding a July 1st start date is that the student never stopped. They continued. They're working with you. So that, again, is not something that has changed. That you'll see in the Quick Start Guide is still the recommended way of handling the period of participation start date, because we haven't necessarily redefined the field and how it functions, but rather we're saying whatever was entered last year, and I realize the definition for data entry last year was different, but whatever we entered last year for the start date was the start date. If the student's continuing, July 1st isn't really the start date, it's the continuing date. The student's continuing into the new year. If, however, more than 90 days pass, the start date would actually be the first date of instruction this year, and you would log that. So it is confusing, but if you think of and work through each student and ask a couple questions, it will hopefully become easier, and then there'll only be a handful of cases that you'll have questions about. So what I mean by that is, if I have student A that comes and I need to determine what their start date is, the first thing I'm going to ask is, were they previously served? And if they were, then the question is going to be, are they continuing or returning? If they're continuing, they get July 1st. If they're returning, that's more than 90 days. They get whatever date they started their instruction per the new definition of that period of participation start date field. So there's a couple things at play. There's a couple moving parts here, and it can be confusing, no doubt. But honestly, if you assess each student using some of the criteria I just mentioned, which again are in accounted for in detail in that quick start guide. That will hopefully help you determine where to go with a lot of the questions that you have. And then if there's something that doesn't fit in there and you're not sure what to do, that's when you can follow up with your advisor. Other questions?
Mhm. Michael,
Rosa, yes.
um, for rollovers, I never used July 1st. I always used the first day they started in July. The class started in July.
Right, and that may be true if they were returning students. You have to ask the 90-day question for each of your adults to determine whether or not they are as a rollover. So it's not just if they're a rollover July 1st. No, it's if they're a rollover, it's either July 1st for continuing or date of first instruction for returning. And the difference is always the same standard we applied during the program year, which is the 90-day interval.
Yes, the 90 days.
Because you could have you could have a group of students, a cohort of students that starts class on July 15th, and some could be continuing and some could be returning depending on their last date of instruction back in the spring, where some may have, for various reasons, we all know there's no one answer for any adult student. They all have their own schedule and reasons for that. So you may have, again, a cohort of all rollover students rather in a class that's start July 15th. Some may be continuing and some may be returning. And so you have to evaluate, per the details in the quick start guide, you have to evaluate what the start date is for each of those adults separately. So July 1st is the date you should be using for continuing students.
That I have never done that before.
Yeah, we've had that. That's been in quick start guide for several years now. And it's just so that we reflect in our reporting, because frankly, the reporting is going to evaluate the dates by date of instruction. And it's going to check to see the July 1st date really is almost a benefit to you so that you know and can spot which students are ones that were continuing from the previous year. Yep, very good questions. In the interest of time, though, I want to move on to just kind of demonstrate and show for all of you some of the new fields in the eData system. And then once we cover all the new fields, then of course I'll kind of pivot back to our PowerPoint and we'll wrap up with some more questions. Most of the things that have been evolved or updated on the eData website have to do with adult records. And so we're just in here in the test site with creating a new adult to just show what those fields look like. I'm not going to go exhaustively through each one of the changes because functionally the system works the same as it did before. For example, on our infamous here period of participation start date field, that simply said last year period of participation enrollment date. And so now start date is just a more accurate reflection of what we're doing. Same thing with just to the right, if you can see it, and actually let me make this affiliated with. So right here, this used to say primary enrollment.
I believe she's spoken to you before.
Of course, not everyone was necessarily enrolled in whatever they were assigned to, so we changed that to primary assignment. And if we scroll up, you'll see that there are some other changes. This field is now sex, not gender. And instead of other name, we've clarified right here that we'd like to have in this field maiden name, preferred name, or nickname. So really, the function of those fields I've just demonstrated and several others have not changed. And really all it is an opportunity for us to clarify just what it is we're looking for when you enter data into those fields. Additionally, the two new fields for adult records are right here. What are your pronouns? And then what is your gender identity? These come from the forms that have been collected for at least a couple years now, but now you can enter this data and you can see the options here. These are both not required fields. So what's going to happen with this is if you leave these as it says select, or in other words, you just leave them blank, so to speak, then what's going to happen is you're just going to be able to save the record and move on. You can leave them without any information entered. But if you do choose to enter information, you can certainly pick from any of the listed fields. Then if we scroll down, you can see, of course, we have a new option for residents. So if I select community is the same as it was, institution is also the same as it was, except now on the right here in the drop down under residence type, there are new options, fewer options than before. Really just summarizing two different options for correctional facilities and then anything else is pretty much how that works. All right, so I just wanted to kind of share that with you. Any questions on these specific fields before we pivot back to just a couple other announcements? Question. So Judy has a question about ESL classes. They're suspended over the summer, more than 90 days pass between stop and restart. So if there's more than 90 days, I think that would mean, yes, you kind of beat me to it, Judy. Yes, they would be returning students, because what defines the difference between returning and continuing is that period of participation question, which is 90 days. So if all the students in that class are surpassing 90 days between last program year and this program year when they were participating in class, getting hours in class, then yes, they would be returning students. And that's a tough concept just by word, because continuing and returning almost sounds like the same thing. But the subtle nuance and difference is, of course, what we've been saying, which is continuing never stopped. They're continuing. Returning means they've been there before, but there's been a time period, in this case, more than 90 days in between. All right, so let's get that out of the way and go right back to our presentation and offer up a couple reminders. These are just kind of announcements here. So we're kind of getting away from eData specifically at this moment to let you know that the access template will be out to be determined. There are some significant changes in the access template. Despite minimal changes in the website, there's significant changes in the template in terms of how ed gains are calculated across various reports and queries. So we are going to work with that. And when we are ready to introduce version 1, we'll also cover what those changes mean. There's no difference. This is just to reflect what's already being reported and what you already all know about educational gains. It's just that we're making the template function in a way that's consistent with that, with those announcements. And then finally, of course, are the Intro to eData courses, which start in mid-September coming up here. There is still room in the September course. So if you want a refresher, or if you have staff that you're aware of that are going to begin data entry tasks, please do let them know about the course. And of course, that's sign up as always in the PA Adult Ed Resources PD portal for that class. And that is a synchronous class, so it will require registration and participation by a specific date. So we'll want to make sure that you get signed up for that. Then after that, really, we just want to make sure and see, you've already asked many good questions, so we can now kind of wrap up the webinar with other questions that you have from anything on screen or anything just in general. And I'm going to pivot here, look at the chat, see if there's anything new in here. It doesn't look like anything new in the chat. Susan, I still see your hand raised. Was that from before, or did you have an additional question?
That was from before, sorry.
Okay, no worries, not at all. All good. Okay, so question from the chat here. Last year, new contracts would appear in eData on Mondays only. Is the process the same this year? Yes, that is my understanding. That is my understanding. So in other words, just to elaborate on that, if that wasn't clear, or if you can't see the chat, the question was new contracts last year appeared in eData on Mondays. And that was because process runs each weekend, I think in the middle of the night, Saturday night, to bring into eData the contract information for e-grants after, of course, the grant information has been sent to the approved status. And my understanding is it's the same process this year. So if you don't see your grant on today, Wednesday, you can check again next Monday. And that would include additional grants if you're already in eData, but you're waiting on, say, family literacy grant or IELCE grant. You just check each week to see what's been added. All right, well, that's all we had for you today. We certainly can hang on and are happy to answer more questions that you may have. Otherwise, I think that's been a good overview of the new items in eData, some questions about the start date field, which again, we would refer some of those nuanced edge cases to your advisor. That's all we have, so you are certainly free to go. If you have a question though, feel free to linger and we will get to those. Otherwise, stay tuned. We'll announce some more webinars and have some more announcements for you as things like the template and other resources come more into focus. But be well.
Michael?
Yes, Janaya.
Hi, so I have a question. We have a student who their highest level of education was special education / an IEP diploma. However, that's no longer an option. What would the alternative be for that?
Yes, that is no longer an option. That is one thing that was edited.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest checking the manual glossary, and if that does not answer your question, check with your advisor.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Good question.
Michael,
Yes, Rosa.
for reportable individuals, the date that we're going to use will be the date they sign the intake because they don't have any other information.
Yeah, so in those cases, we don't actually have a start date for those students. So in lieu of the start date per the definition, that seems like a reasonable selection until and if they actually then show up and engage in some activities, which at that time you would need to update the start date.
Great, thank you.
Yep. I'm going to stop the recording because I don't think we need that now.